For millions of years, the safest place on Earth for our ancestors wasn't a cave, wasn't open ground. It was up above, tucked into the branches of a tree, far from the jaws of anything that hunted at night. So here's a genuinely strange question worth asking. If the trees were so safe, why did our ancestors ever leave them? Why did they choose, generation after generation, to sleep down on the open ground instead? This is the story of one of the strangest trade-offs in all of human evolution, giving up a safe bed in the branches for a dangerous bed on the ground. And somehow, that trade-off is a big part of why you're able to watch this video right now. Let's start with life in the trees, because for a huge stretch of our evolutionary history, that's genuinely all our ancestors knew. Early hominids, the ones who looked far more like apes than humans, spent almost their entire lives up in the canopy. And trees offered something the ground simply never could: real distance from the predators that ruled the forest floor. Big cats, hyenas, and other ground hunters were fast, strong, and far too dangerous to sleep anywhere near. At night specifically, these early ancestors built simple nests out of leaves and bent branches, weaving them together the same way chimpanzees and gorillas still do today, creating a soft, elevated platform far above the danger below. And this wasn't a one-off habit. Fresh nests were built almost every single night because old ones would sag, collapse, or simply become unstable after just a day or two of use in the branches. So life in the canopy was genuinely safe from ground predators, but it came with its own quiet cost: constant effort, limited space, and a body built specifically for climbing rather than doing much of anything else. Then something extraordinary began to happen. Slowly, over an enormous stretch of time, our ancestors started spending more and more time down on the ground, walking upright on two legs instead of moving on all fours. And this single shift in posture would eventually force a much bigger decision, whether to keep climbing back into the trees every night, or to start building a completely different kind of life on the ground. So why did this shift even start? A big part of the answer is climate. Over long stretches of time, dense forests in parts of Africa slowly shrank, and wide-open grasslands began spreading in their place. And on a landscape like that, with trees scattered far apart instead of packed close together, spending your whole life swinging branch to branch simply stopped being practical. Standing tall and walking became far more useful instead. Walking upright also freed up something incredibly valuable: hands. Hands that used to be needed for gripping branches could now carry food, carry tools, and even carry young children across long distances. But this new freedom came with a real cost. Bodies built for decades of tree climbing began slowly changing, and they were no longer well suited for swinging safely through branches the way they once had been. Hips widened to support long, stable walking. Legs lengthened for covering ground efficiently. Feet flattened out, losing much of the flexible grip that once made climbing high into a canopy so effortless. And here's the part that really matters. This wasn't a quick trade our ancestors could switch in and out of whenever they wanted. Once these changes took hold, going back to serious tree climbing became genuinely difficult, which meant that with bodies no longer built for climbing high into the canopy every single night, our ancestors had no real choice left. They had to start sleeping much closer to the ground, whether that felt safe or not. And that single shift meant something genuinely frightening. They were now far more exposed to the exact predators they had spent millions of years successfully avoiding by simply staying up in the branches. Sleeping exposed like this on open ground, night after night, for generation after generation, would have been an enormous sustained selection pressure. Only certain behaviors and certain strategies could keep a group reliably alive. This is exactly where fire enters the story, and it completely rewrote the rules of nighttime survival. Once early humans learned how to reliably control flame, they suddenly had a powerful new tool working in their favor. Because most large predators, no matter how fast or powerful, shared one deep instinctive fear: fire. A simple burning flame turned out to be more effective at keeping lions and hyenas away than any tree branch ever could. So fire gave our ancestors something the trees used to provide, a genuine barrier between themselves and whatever hunted in the dark. Except now, that barrier could be carried and rebuilt anywhere, not just found in a lucky tall tree. But fire alone still wasn't a complete solution. Flames burn down, fuel runs out. And deep into the night, when the fire is at its weakest, something else had to fill that gap in protection. That gap was filled by the group itself. A single ancestor sleeping alone on open ground was easy prey for almost anything, but a tight circle of bodies gathered closely around a fire was an entirely different story. This kind of group sleeping meant more eyes to notice danger, more warning if a predator approached, and simply more bodies making any single individual much harder to single out and attack. It's very likely that some kind of rotating watch developed too, one or two members of the group staying partly alert while the rest slept more deeply, a strategy still seen in many social animals today. So the ground stopped being simply dangerous and slowly became survivable, but only through a very specific combination: fire, group closeness, and shared vigilance working together as a single system. Now here's where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because leaving the trees didn't just change where our ancestors slept. It actually helped reshape the human brain itself, and here's the surprising reason why. Sleeping flat on the ground, on prepared bedding near a steady fire, allowed for genuinely deeper and more restorative sleep than anything possible, while wedged awkwardly into a swaying tree branch nest. And deeper, more consistent sleep is directly linked to sharper memory, better problem solving, and stronger learning, the exact mental tools our ancestors increasingly needed as life on the ground grew more complex. In other words, better ground sleep may have quietly fueled better thinking, which in turn helped these early humans build smarter fires, smarter shelters, and eventually smarter tools and stronger social groups. Over time, early humans also stopped relying purely on open ground and a fire circle for protection. They began building actual shelters, using branches, animal hides, rocks, and whatever natural materials happened to be nearby. A shelter like this added yet another physical layer of protection, blocking wind, blocking rain, and making it considerably harder for a predator to approach unnoticed in the dark. As many, many generations passed, human bodies continued adapting further and further away from tree life. Arms grew relatively shorter. Shoulders gradually lost the flexibility once needed for swinging comfortably between branches, and feet flattened out almost completely, becoming built specifically for walking and running rather than gripping bark. In other words, there truly was no going back to a life lived mainly in the trees anymore. So, by giving up the safety of the branches, early humans unknowingly opened the door to an entirely new way of living, one that the trees could genuinely never have supported. They could now travel much further across open landscapes, following herds of animals across huge distances that would have been completely impossible while confined mainly to a patchy, disconnected forest canopy. They could hunt larger animals using coordinated group strategy instead of relying purely on ambush from above. And they could build lasting, stable communities instead of small, scattered, tree-bound family groups. And eventually, over an enormous stretch of time, these ground-adapted humans spread out across every single continent on Earth. From freezing northern plains to dense tropical regions far from where it all began. None of that expansion would have been realistically possible for a species still tied down to sleeping safely in trees every single night. The ground, dangerous as it was, turned out to be the only path toward that kind of freedom. Now, it's worth pausing here, because leaving the trees clearly wasn't some sudden dramatic decision made overnight by one bold ancestor. It was an extremely slow, gradual trade-off, playing out across countless generations. A trade-off between the reliable safety of the branches above and the freedom, strength, and growing intelligence that came specifically from standing tall and facing the open ground below. Whatever risks that involved. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. We often imagine our ancient ancestors as constantly fearful, sleeping poorly, barely surviving each dangerous night out in the open. But the evidence actually tells a very different story. These were problem solvers, working with fire, shelter, group cooperation, and shared watchfulness, turning a genuinely dangerous situation into something reliably survivable. And they solved that problem well enough that their descendants eventually built entire civilizations on the very ground their ancestors once feared to sleep on at all. Now think about your own bed tonight, elevated slightly off the floor, tucked safely inside solid walls, locked doors keeping any danger firmly outside. It looks nothing at all like a woven nest of leaves in a tree, but the underlying logic honestly hasn't changed nearly as much as you might expect. Get elevated or otherwise protected from whatever might be moving around at ground level while you're most vulnerable and unaware. Surround yourself with trusted people, whether that's family sleeping under the same roof, or a locked door standing in for that ancient ring of firelight your ancestors once relied on so heavily. Even your instinctive discomfort at the idea of sleeping completely alone, out in the open, with no walls, no lock, and no one nearby, traces directly back to that same evolutionary pressure your ancestors faced constantly. None of that discomfort is a coincidence. It's inheritance, carried forward quietly in instinct, long after anyone consciously remembers exactly where that particular fear originally came from. So the next time you climb into your own bed tonight, behind solid walls and a locked door, it might be worth remembering that your ancestors paid a very real price over millions of years to make that simple comfort possible. They traded the reliable safety of the canopy for the open, dangerous ground below, and slowly, deliberately built an entirely new system of fire, shelter, and cooperation strong enough to replace what the trees once provided. And in doing so, they didn't just find a new way to sleep safely at night. They unlocked freedom, intelligence, and an entirely different future for every single generation that would eventually follow them, including thousands of generations later, you sleeping safely tonight in a bed your ancient tree-dwelling ancestors could genuinely never have imagined.